Iran's presidential candidates go head-to-head while anger mounts about how they were chosen. Critics say the odds have been tipped in the front-runners' favour. As world powers hold talks to revive the 2015 nuclear deal, what impact will this vote have? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. As Iran's presidential candidates hold their televised debate, there's a much bigger debate about the election itself. Only a handful of the hundreds of people who applied to run were approved by the election watchdog. And the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei says some of those rejected were, quote, wronged. Iranians now have a choice between 7 candidates, 5 so-called hardliners and 2 seen as moderates. The contentious elimination process has helped the prospects of hardline judiciary chief Ebrahim Raisi, who's favoured to win. Raisi is an ally of the Ayatollah Khamenei, but anger about the candidate bans and the weak economy may dent the Supreme Leader's hopes of a high turnout.
Some want to give up the duty to participate in the election with absurd reasons. It is the will of the enemies of Iran, the enemies of Islam, and the enemies of religious democracy.
Al Jazeera's Asad Beg's in Tehran. He says there is a definite lack of enthusiasm.
This presidential election has been notable not for mainly who is standing, but who's been disqualified. 3 times former Speaker of Parliament Ali Larijani was disqualified by the Guardian Council, this vetting body, but also former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Now, the latter came out and said that he would not be voting for anybody and wouldn't be throwing his support behind any candidate. Now, yesterday, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei came out and he said that there had been an injustice done in terms of the Guardian Council decision. And we thought that the Guardian Council may reverse its decision, but they stood by it, and Ali Larijani, who was backed by the moderates and reformists, is still disqualified and not allowed to stand. Now, the frontrunner in this entire election, this election campaign, is the judiciary chief, Ebrahim Raisi. Now, he is the establishment's choice. He is a conservative. Some consider him a hardliner, and they have thrown their support behind him. Some of the other candidates are not as prominent, not as well known, and there are many here that think that this is a done deal, that Ebrahim Raisi will become the country's next president. Nevertheless, there are still some pressing issues for these candidates to debate. One of the major issues is the economy. Inflation is very high, unemployment is high, and the economy has been ravaged by US sanctions. And day to day, what really affects people here is their livelihoods, the cost of goods, and finding jobs for the younger generation. But one of the main concerns for the establishment, though, is voter turnout. Last year, in the parliamentary elections, saw the lowest voter turnout since the start of the revolution in 1979, and there is concern that there will be another low voter turnout. Now, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has come out and said that people need to come out. It's their duty to come out and vote for the dignity of the country and for the establishment. But so far, we have not seen that much enthusiasm, at least here on the streets of Tehran.
Okay, there we are. Here we go. Let's bring in today's guests. We have journalist and Iran affairs analyst Mostafa Khoshcheshm in Tehran. In Washington, we have Mark Fitzpatrick, the acting director of the non-proliferation program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And out of London, Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, a senior research fellow and head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to you all. Mostafa, coming to you first. With this election, what's at stake?
Hello, and thanks for having me. As a matter of fact, after quite a long time, 8 years, that Rouhani was in office with one single plan that entailed détente with the United States in order to remove the sanctions and move forward. And the JCPOA has failed to, meet the expectations of the public. Now it seems that those that were the proponents of this program are not going to stage a very large turnout at the polls in support of the same view. And those that are critical of this view will be the core of participants in this election, not only with regard to the candidates, but also with regard to the turnout that we expect. So it could be predicted pretty well that the next administration will be completely different from the one that's ruling the country under President Rouhani right now. And foreign policy as well as economy, and especially economy, would experience a strategic and a very fundamental shift, relying more on domestic capabilities as well as expanding ties with the neighbors, détente with the neighbors, as well as expanding ties and strategic cooperation with Latin America, with Africa, with China, Russia, and others that are not mainly in the Western bloc. So the country is expecting a major shift in every aspect.
Aniseh, Bassiri, Tabrizi in London. Predicted turnout possibly bottoming out less than 40%. 35% of people who are polled saying we're not going to vote. What's the point?
Well, I think we are definitely in a situation in which elections are going to be interesting to watch. We have seen previous elections in which the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic has very much been linked to the voter turnout. I think in this case, the establishment is depicting a different picture, which is that continuation, that stability. This is what really matters more than voter turnout. They have some room of maneuver to play in terms of obviously COVID and the fact that this can be blamed for the turnout. But really, I think people are aware that this is very much linked to the offering of the candidates, for which the debates and ranges of view is much more limited than before. And that obviously increases the apathy, if you wish, and disinterest by the population to participate in this election. I think what is going to be interesting is seeing, despite it all, who is going to be prevailing among this very strict range of candidates, and what this will mean, more importantly, for Iran's foreign policy posture moving ahead.
Mark Fitzpatrick in Washington, on that idea of Tehran's foreign policy posture, chances are, all the indicators are, that Mr. Rouhani is about to be replaced with someone who is, at a political DNA level, if you will, hostile to the West. How does that dovetail or not with the Biden administration?
Well, the Biden administration will deal with whomever is in power in Iran. The administration wants to restore the deal that was struck in 2015 in order to block Iran's potential paths to a nuclear weapon. And it looks like this deal will be restored. Implementation will be tricky, but I think the Biden administration will provide for enough sanctions relief so as to give the next administration in Iran a leg up. Whoever wins this election is going to benefit from the restoration of the JCPOA. And one last point, it's interesting that the Biden administration was not really in a huge hurry to restore the JCPOA. They didn't want to make unnecessary concessions just in order to get a deal with the Rouhani current administration. Biden realizes that Rouhani will be replaced, and so let the negotiations continue, and however long it takes. But they do want to restore the deal.
Mostafa, Khoshcheshm there in Tehran. Was there as much surprise in Tehran as there was across the region when Mr. Larijani was barred? Because he's so well connected. It's part of his political bone marrow. He's well connected. He knows all the top people. You've got to do that. You've got to be that person. And yet the Guardian Council said, no, you should not, you will not stand.
Well, there was some surprise at the beginning, but later when we came to know that there were 3 reasons that he was not qualified and he was not in the final list of 7. Mainly, the first reason, which was mentioned, then he came under attack and his reputation was damaged for that, was his daughter's residence and citizenship in the United States, which came to be not true actually later. And what the Iranian leader asked yesterday was asking the Iranian media, the intelligence ministry, and everyone to extend an apology to Larijani for this reason, though he was not qualified. He never qualified for two other reasons, actually. So the decision is the same, but a wrong reason actually was being mentioned among the public. That's why the Iranian leader asked everyone to extend an apology. But considering that Larijani represents kind of Rouhani's logic and rationale towards foreign policy and economy, he would not actually have much of a chance to win the election unless the election season would go too polar and, unless for the bad performance of the principalist or the revolutionary camp, Larijani would not have a good chance to win this election.
Aniseh, Tabrizi, is it wrong to describe Iran, forgive me if this sounds overly simplistic, is it wrong to describe Iran as a, quote, democracy? Last time there was an election, 2017, more than 1,600 people put themselves forward to be candidates. The Guardian Council chose 7 people. So point number 1, is the word democracy wrong? And point number 2, who actually runs the country?
Well, I mean, I think we would need to stay here for hours to unpack the structure of the Iranian system. But I think, simply put, Iran is an Islamic republic. So I think the best definition of how Iran works is a mix of Islamic component and a mix of republic component. In some cases, one dominates versus the other. And I think in these particular elections, there have been probably a lot of consideration about whether the Republican component have been taken enough into account compared to the past, because obviously the restriction that we have heard about when it comes to Larijani, but also other candidates, have been perceived even within those within the establishment as too restrictive, even for the Islamic Republic consideration. So I think, obviously, it juggles between these two criteria. And I think this is what makes it very complicated, very difficult to understand, but also very difficult to predict in which direction it will go, both in terms of outcome of the election, but also in terms of stance domestically and internationally.
Mark Fitzpatrick in Washington, how much momentum is there in now the 5th, going into the 6th round of talks about the 2015 nuclear deal? Or maybe I framed that question the wrong way. How much inertia is there within that process? Because the reality surely is that Tehran has made its own advances. And once you accept that, you can't unsee it. You can't not know about that.
So the negotiations have been proceeding in an orderly fashion, and sometimes the one participant or another talks about with optimism about the progress that has been made. But as I see it, there are still some considerable sticking points, and the negotiations won't be completed until one side or the other fundamentally changes its posture. And this regards a couple of things, but most importantly on the issue of sanctions. Iran has been demanding that all sanctions imposed by President Trump be removed. He had over 1,500 designations of people and entities put on the Treasury blacklist. Now, some of these people and entities were put on there for very legitimate reasons involving their human rights violations, their interference in U.S. elections, their support for terrorist groups. Sometimes the counterterrorism designations were kind of a sham, because the real purpose was to impede Trump's successor from restoring the JCPOA. Biden has said, his team has said, that all sanctions that are inconsistent with restoring the JCPOA will be removed, but they're not going to remove sanctions on people who interfered in the U.S. election or who slaughtered hundreds of Iranian demonstrators. So if Iran insists that all sanctions be removed, they're going to have to artfully redefine what all means. And I don't think the Iran leadership is ready to do that, maybe until after the election. They don't want to have any big news that might impede what looks like a coronation of Raisi. This is a sham election, and they needed to proceed without incident, and then afterwards they can allow the negotiations to be completed.
Mostafa, on that idea that there's a change of posture has to come from somebody, someplace, i.e. somebody has to blink first. We don't have hours on this show to drill down into who actually runs the country. So would the Guardian Council go with the idea of reform or a change of posture if whoever replaces Rouhani said that was a good idea? Because Article 4 of your country's constitution, correct me if I'm wrong here, Article 4 of your country's constitution says this: all laws, all new reforms, all changes have to be Islamic. And it's the Guardian Council that decides whether new laws are or are not Islamic.
The JCPOA has already been approved by the Parliament and the Guardian Council. It's Iranian foreign policy under the Constitution. The strategic goals are specified by the Iranian leader, but the governments are very much effective on this path because the Iranian leader has proved to be working with any kind of government, from reformist Khatami to Rouhani or Ahmadinejad. They offer their strategies to the leader, and he works with them the same way that he allowed Rouhani to start JCPOA, while he said, I am pessimistic towards the results. And he has been proved to be right in every aspect. So basically speaking, if they strike a deal with the Rouhani administration, and I believe they have their best shot now, and if the next government comes, they don't care really much for what the U.S. wants. It doesn't mean that they will be radicals. They want to increase tensions. No, of course not. What we see right now in the first presidential debate on economy is telling us that they have a well-detailed plan in order to defuse the U.S. sanctions, in order to defuse the U.S. containment strategy. What the U.S. has done, especially Donald Trump and Biden, they have been building up 4 layers of similar, identical sanctions with concerning the results of these sanctions. And they want to strike the nuclear deal and get back to the deal again, but only remove one of the layers in a way that it doesn't work. Iran would not, be released from the pressure of sanctions. And they want to get more and more and more from Iran, missile industry, regional power, and so on and so forth. Tehran knows that pretty well. That's why no matter who rules the country, Tehran says that all these sanctions after the JCPOA should be removed. Iran should be given verification.
We'll come on to that point of sanctions in just a second, Mostafa. You make a very valid point, though, because that's why the middle classes have suffered, and that's why the economy suffered, and that's why the currency has suffered as well. Aniseh, Bassiri, Tabrizi in London. If it is Mr. Raisi, he's on already a US designated list of being rather, how can I put it delicately, questionable. How do you get everyone else involved in this process to get the JCPOA back up and running with a good, healthy heartbeat? How do you talk to a president who's on a US list of people that we don't like?
Well, I think it's a very good question, but I think the assessment here is that the deal would be resumed before the new president would be elected. So we are talking a very, very strict timeline. It's true that there are still a lot of sticking points, but there is also the deadline for the agreement between Iran and the IAEA, which expires on the 24th of June. So I think there is a lot of push for getting something done, if not before the elections, at least before the expiration of this newly renewed agreement, which obviously poses a lot of concerns for the US and the European countries in particular. And I think the idea is to have the agreement signed, announced then, and then implemented between June and August, so before the new president comes in. Generally speaking, I think it's going to be challenging for the US to engage with the new president, if not on the JCPOA front. I mean, we already have to look at UNGA, for instance, which is a forum that is normally depicted as one of the potential for the two sides to engage, not just on a nuclear issue, but also on broader issues. So I think there is going to be a broader question mark about how the US will be able to engage with Iran. But obviously, Raisi is just one figure, and notoriously is not the one that normally engages in this negotiation. We have specific people who are designated as negotiator, and these, to our knowledge, are not appointed yet, and we don't know if there will be in any list, if at all.
Okay, Mark Fitzpatrick, coming back to you in Washington, I'm sure Mostafa in Tehran won't mind me paraphrasing what he had to say in his last answer to my last question when he was talking. He was basically saying that there is a certain optimism and a certain desire to engage with this process again. But what if, despite whoever becomes Iranian president, what if the Iranians then say, actually, dear fellow interlocutors, we want to talk about our missile capabilities? Because, correct me if I'm wrong here, Mark, the original JCPOA, when it was all confected 2014 and 2015, they were very, very clever because they took missile ambition and they kind of put that on the back burner and they said, no, this is about generating nuclear power. This is about meeting your power energy requirements first and foremost. And there are other issues which we can talk about down the line.
So the Biden administration and his European partners definitely want to get on to other issues after the JCPOA is restored. They want to talk about Iran's missiles and the missiles that Iran has been sending to its partners like Hamas, which rains them down on Israel. This is a big issue throughout the Western world. Iran so far has said that it won't talk about these other issues, but the Supreme Leader did say that if the United States establishes trust by implementing the JCPOA and it can be verified, then he opened the door to talking about other issues. I think it will be to Iran's advantage. And Iran already is talking with Saudi Arabia, of course, about Yemen and possibly other regional issues. So, I think there will be avenues to engage with Iran. Maybe not with Mr. Raisi, who is a murderer, but with his foreign minister. The United States, does deal with abhorrent governments in other countries.
Mostafa Khoshcheshm there in Tehran, you're shaking your head. I just want to move on to a slightly different area in our discussion today. Assuming for a second, despite a low turnout, despite a record low turnout, possibly if it dips below 40%, that will arguably strengthen Khamenei's position at home. Given that, how much trust will then flow from Tehran to Washington, wrapped up in an expectation that Washington will give Tehran what it wants?
Peter, give me a minute. I'm truly sorry to hear that one of the guests is insulting my country. I'm sorry, and the election in my country and me, myself, and the Iranian people by calling one of the presidential candidates a murderer or calling the system of election in Iran as a sham. When you had the presidential election in the United States with Donald Trump, that everyone knows, we still respected you and your system of election. Nobody would allow 1,000 people to go for, the votes, and people would be confused what to do with 1,000 people, especially considering that they need to have enough time through the state-run TV channels and internet TVs and so on and so forth. So it's not possible to give 1,000 people the chance, similar chances to represent their ideas. So every country has a system.
Understood. Mostafa, I'm going to have to interrupt you there, for which I sincerely apologise. In 10 seconds, how much trust is there now in Tehran aimed at America?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The United States' performance with regard to the JCPOA has made Iranians shift their idea about who should run the country. The Iranians are not fond of parties and systems. They don't like the parties. They like the figures. And now the figures that I see on TV presenting a well-detailed plan about the economy and how to deal with the United States very rationally and courageously, I believe they would win the election because they have a well-detailed plan that would end this deadlock with the United States eventually.
Okay, we must leave it there. Thank you so much to our guests. They were Mostafa Khoshcheshm, Mark Fitzpatrick and Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi. And thank you too for your company. You can see the programme again anytime via our website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're on Twitter, of course. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobbie, and everyone on the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We will see you very soon. For the moment, goodbye.